Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for seeing me.
Okay.
I think maybe you should make an introduction to the camera. Who are you?
Okay. My name's John Collins. Um, I, I'm a musicologist, a musician. Been in Ghana since the 50s. In fact, I'm a Ghanaian now. Been working at the University of Legon music department for over 20 years. Run bands, recording studios, and I was interviewed by Carl 20 years ago. So this is a continuation of that conversation.
Thank you very much. Well, 20 years ago, my first question of you was, how do you see the popular music scene of Ghana? And you talked a lot about there was a vast amount of gospel music. So
Yes.
20 years have passed, and I guess a lot of things has happened since then.
Yeah, I mean, the gospel music is still as strong as ever, if not stronger. But one interesting thing is that there's a lot of women who have now been trained in the churches, who have now moved, not a lot, but I mean significant number, who have moved into popular music. It's a type of music they now call Afro-pop, and it's basically sort of an African take on contemporary urban, contemporary R&B, and because women play a significant role in America and Europe, you know, like Beyonce and others in this style, it's opened up an avenue for women in Ghana, and we have a lot of trained singers. So I'm just trying to think, there's Effia, Becca, there's Riala, there's a whole bunch of ladies now who play in this Afro-pop idiom. Sometimes in English, sometimes in a local language, but it's got this sort of neo-soul, contemporary urban. But it's interesting because these are women who pass through the churches and been trained to sing. So the gospel music is still there, but there's also this thing that's, it's a bit like the, in America, if you take soul music, Aretha Franklin coming out of the church and going into music. It's a similar sort of process is going on. And I think when I spoke to you 20 years ago, women hadn't come out of the churches into secular music. It's not vast numbers. I mean, in terms of numbers of churches in Ghana now, African churches, nobody knows the figure. Figures of as much as 50,000. When you came here 20 years ago, the official figure of the number of churches in Ghana was around about 3,000. The BBC came out with a guesstimate or estimate recently, and it was 50,000. These are separate denominations, and a lot of them endorse dance music. So I would say that the church is stronger than it was 20 years ago, and the music, the gospel music too.
And what about the Highlife and the Hiplife? How did it develop, and is it still alive?
Yes, of course the Highlife never died completely, but the Hiplife sort of eclipsed it like 20 years ago. And of course the Hiplife at that time was mimed on stage. It wasn't usually a live performance. Hiplife went through a series of transformations, and there was one style called, in the early 2000s, called Jama Hiplife, which they use, it's the Ga word for traditional dances. It's not an actual dance, but it's the youth's name for traditional rhythms. So this type of Hiplife, instead of using American funk beats, they started to use local rhythms. So the youth called it Jama Hiplife. So there was that change going on. And then around about 2000 also, some of the first hiplifers started to perform live performance, like Sydney and others like that. So hiplife itself changed. It became more, not just the words were Ghanaian, but the actual rhythms were Ghanaian. And then they started to perform live. And then about 10 years ago, from that generation of singers and artists, came what we now call contemporary highlife, which is one of the dominant forms of popular music in Ghana. And it was basically some of the, you know, within hiplife itself, there was sort of what do you call it, strata. levels. One of them is there had always been singers in hiplife. So sometimes somebody would sing or chant, and then somebody would rap. But the chanting, singing side of hiplife basically has come to the fore. And these youth, what they do is they sing rather than rap, and they draw on highlife music, and they call themselves contemporary highlifers. So there are people like Kissa Bidi and Kofi Kenata. There's a whole bunch of them now. And of course the most famous, the top music right at this very moment for the youth is dancehall, Jamaican dancehall. And even Jamaican dancehall and ragga were part of hiplife. So you could say, even back to 15 years ago, there was some of the hiplife artists were using ragga techniques or dancehall techniques of toasting and chanting instead of rapping. So it was a sort of a submerged part of the hiplife scene. So what you could say is hiplife is broken into pieces. And the ragga, the dancehall, has become an independent entity. People like Samani and Stoneboy, they're sort of, sometimes they sing in patois, Jamaican patois, sometimes in local languages. Then the contemporary contemporary highlife is split out of this as well. So hiplife in its old form, it still exists. Some people call it GH rap, because they stick to the rapping, Ghana rapping. So, but the most important thing is people have returned to live performance. That's what's really interesting. So whether you're playing dancehall, or you're playing contemporary highlife, or even a lot of the hiplifers, or you're doing Afro-pop, which attracts a lot of women, it's live performance is what you're going to get now. So when I saw you last, I was quite pessimistic, because miming or lip syncing to backing tracks means that a lot of traditional guitarists and horn players, drummers and so on, they were made unemployed by the situation, because the youth rejected that music with live instruments. But now they're integrating live instruments even into hiplife. There's a guy called King Ayasoba who works with hiplifers, and he plays the northern lute. And they're using these jammer rhythms. Sometimes they're electronic, but they're still based on traditional rhythms. So there's been quite a big shift in Ghana. It's like, you could say the hiplife generation 20 years ago had rejected the music of the older generation, which is highlife, live music, real instruments. But the children of the hiplifers, which is like the grandchildren, have come back to some extent. At a different level of, it's not, they haven't gone exactly back, but they spiraled back towards the music of the older generation, because they're not so antagonistic as the hiplife generation. Because there it's the father against son sort of thing. But with the grandchildren, it's like in Denmark. You have isn't it Christian and Frederick? You alternate them. Well, it's in cultures, you often get skipping the generations in terms of not only the transmission of names, like your royal family, and also in Ghana, many societies, you're named after your grandparent. But it's because it reflects a much more friendly relationship between the grandchild and the grandparent, because the grandparents are not the ones who discipline the children. So the age gap, the tension between the generations usually occurs between, father and son, two adjacent generations. So what we're happening now is what I call the grandfather or grandparent effect. I've now become a grandparent, technically, by my age. So whereas I had a problem with the hiplife generation, they were very hostile to me and my generation. Their children, the ones coming up now, we call them the millennials, right? There's a lot of them now turning towards their roots, exploring, and they sometimes come here and ask for advice. They're my students. They're not rejecting traditional music and traditional highlife totally. They're trying to explore it again. So we've come full circle.
Sankofa.
It's a sort of Sankofa in a sort of a spiraling circular way. Yes, it's a Sankofa plus the grandparent-grandchild feature of Sankofa, because the Sankofa thing, going back to the past, often goes in spirals. It altered, maybe your generation disliked your parents' music, but your children will dislike your music and therefore like your parents' music. It's like styles of dress. You know, one generation the dress is high, and two generations, and then it goes low, and then the third generation it comes up, or whatever it is. So I've noticed this, and right now there are a number of young Ghanaians who are really interested in talking to elderly people, because they realize that their parents, because they rejected the older generation, they nearly lost the information. And the younger generation seems to have made a decision in various ways to reconnect by reinventing Highlife, but still played electronically, but it's still Highlife, or singing instead of rapping, or talking to elderly people. They've become interested in talking to elderly people. So it's, as I say, I call it the grandparent clause.
If we talk about the instrumentation of the music, there was a shift from the acoustic instruments to the computer, the keyboard.
Yes.
And what now? What kind of instruments are played and seen? Or is it a mix?
It's a mix. Still, basically, they are still using electronic music, even to play Highlife. The reason is that there are hundreds of recording studios that record in this way or have the facilities, and a lot of the expert musicians, trumpeters, guitarists, have died out, run away, joined the churches. The churches where the live musicians ended up, because in the churches they discovered that if you try to use the music's too synthetic or it's mined, you can't raise up the Holy Ghost. So that's a place where a lot of the live music or the live artists operated for the last 20 years. But you could now say that, in fact, like I was saying with Hiplife, there's a lot of experimentation, even with live instruments, like the lute or the goje fiddle. They sometimes will bring these in, or sometimes it's a loop of a traditional, it may not be a traditional musician, but it might be a loop of a traditional recording. Or they turn the beats, Highlife rhythms or adwa and so on, into electronic form, but it's still polyphonic or syncopated. So they haven't rejected technology, but they're using technology to re-examine the past. So you can't really say they've gone back to the past. They've sort of spiraled back to the past. So you do see now, and in the contemporary Highlife, when it started a few years ago, they tended to use samples of guitar band Highlife musicians, but now they're beginning to use actual Highlife guitarists. So they are, and sometimes you see trumpets and horn sections coming in. So I think there has been a shift with the younger generation, the children of the Hiplife generation. So I mean, I guess I belong to the baby boom generation in Europe. Then came Generation X, the punks, and then we have now the millennials. Well, something like this is happening in Ghana. I belong to the older Highlife generation. Then came the Hiplife generation, a bit like Generation X, completely against their parents, producing music which is so different from their parents, punk music, you know, or here it would be Hiplife. And then the next generation down who are now coming up in their 20s, and they are very, very interested. I've got a class at Shesi University of young guys doing science, 45 people in my class. I teach them, I do occasional teaching there, and the level of interest in African history and music and everything. I mean, I hadn't seen this before. My own son has got this block. He went to the University at Legon. He's a guitarist, runs a gospel band actually. But his group are very interested. They're doing a project now to go and interview elderly people, not necessarily in music, could be in other areas, you know, like life culture. They've realized that they may lose the grandparents' knowledge, and so they're reconnecting with the grandparents' generation, which is in Ghana basically the Highlife generation.
Okay. Last time we talked about the lyrics. They were shifting from some more problem-focused lyrics to European romanticism.
Yes.
Is there a change within the lyrics now, or is it still this you and me going together love affair?
That's still the dominant theme. Outside of the church, which is love of God, in the secular music, whether it's Afro pop or dance hall or Hiplife, and even contemporary highlife, it's all to do with erotic and romantic love. But there are certain genres which tend towards more social commentary or political ideology, and not when I say politics, I don't just more social conscience in the. I mean, one of course is reggae. Roots reggae is very big in Ghana. So those people who follow the Bob Marley example will often use reggae as protest. In fact, the overthrow of President Campari in Burkina Faso 3 years ago, the corrupt leader of that country, was triggered by a civilian movement called Citizens Brew to sweep the corrupt people away. And it was led by two musicians. I think one was called Sam K. Lajar, who was a reggae artist, and the other one was called Smokey, who's a hip-hopper. So reggae has become quite a vehicle for that style of protest. And then you could also say, to some extent, what we call GH rap. It's the more die-hard rappers who still, I mean, there's a band called VVIP, which is basically Reggie Rockston plus the old VIP band. They tend often to have not political but social messages, because the Jammer hip life that I mentioned, based on Ghanaian dance rhythms, is more for party time. So it's less interested in the lyrics. And then we have, what else? There's some other types of music which, there's what they call now the underground. When I was in Europe as a young person, we had the hippies, the underground. And when I came to Ghana, there was nothing like this. And this has emerged in the last few years. And it's sort of represented by certain types of poets, rap poets, live performance, small intimate groups that play at nightclubs, but to intimate audiences. There's a guy called, what's his name now, Manifest. And there's a whole bunch of these guys. And also there's One Love, the Kubalor. They're small groups like this that are experimenting. They're going back to their roots. They're trying to re-examine traditional music. They will use xylophones. And their politics are quite political. In fact, Kubalor actually came out with the songs called Kill All the Christians, which is quite a serious thing to say in Ghana, as it's 65% Christian. I don't think he meant it literally in the song. It was just a critique. So we do have, there is some sort of stirrings of a more conscious, not just talking about women and love and romance. And then some of the hip lifers themselves have also gone into politics, in a sense, but it's party politics. They've written songs, or some of their songs have been endorsed by the political parties. But I wouldn't call that real politics. Party politics to me is not real politics. It's just factions of the ruling class. So you do get that type of politics. There's been a whole bunch of songs that have been endorsed by the different ruling groups. But mainly the hip lifers still sing about romantic, erotic love and material possessions. In other words, how does a young man, because it's a macho, very few women hip lifers, how does a young man survive in a neoliberal capitalist society that's dedicated to, possessions? The women gravitate into the churches, as they've been doing for the last 20, 30 years, or now they're gravitating to Afro-pop, which is a sort of R&B form, but it's very much centered around romantic love, but from a woman's point of view. That would be the difference, not from the man's point of view necessarily. So they're can be a little bit feminist even. So there's a lot of different things happening here.
Now, when you talk about politics, you have had an election, a peaceful election. You went to a new president. What role did the popular music play in the election? You mentioned it a little bit.
Yeah, I can't remember through all the elections in the last 15, 20 years since we returned to democracy. There's been these songs that there was one, for instance, I think it was written by Sydney. Was it? It was called. It's a song about. It has a refrain that talks about the honourables, the MPs in Parliament, having smelly socks. Even an MP has smelly socks. And at first it was rejected by I think it was the NPP. I can't remember which party it was. but then they endorsed it. I mean, so there have been these songs which, not as, sometimes they're specifically written for a political party, and sometimes they're just endorsed by a political party. And then there's been the Musicians Union has also done a lot of songs on serious sort of problems in the society over the last 15-20 years. For instance, there was a spate of murders of women that went on about 10 years ago, and they called a lot of bands together to alert people, conscientize people about this problem. Then there was a war up in the Dagomba War. There were a lot of songs, peace songs. And then for this election there was, I think, quite a number of musicians, including I think the Musicians Union, did songs for peace and, you know, this type of thing. So there has been quite a lot of this going on.
Do you see any influence from the northern traditional music coming down south?
This is the big difference. This is one of the biggest changes that's happened, is the northern music has become really, really seriously important for the first time. You know, when I was first in Ghana, playing in bands and all that, the number of northern artists, you couldn't even count them on one hand. I'm talking about popular music. You know, Christy Azuma, maybe a few. There was this guy, Amwa Zangil, who played with Iwali Sounds. There were a few. Uppers International was a band in Bolgatanga. But now there's an influx of northern artists. Samani, even some of the hiplifers, VIP, are partly, they're Nima guys, but they all come from the north. Samani is from the north. King Ayasoba, I just mentioned, is from the north. There's people like Atongo Zimba who are making waves from the north. There's a number of reasons for this. One of them, I mean a very simplistic one, is that Rawlings put electricity into Tamale in the 80s. You can't have a recording industry if you don't have electricity. So since the 80s, a small recording industry has evolved in Tamale that acts as a center for northern artists. Another factor is the huge numbers of tourists coming to the country who've already been sensitized to the Sahelian music of Umu Sangari, Salif Keita. The sort of Sahelian music in the world music area is very significant, you know, so that now Ghana has its own savannah or Sahelian sounds coming from the north. So I think there's a number of factors that have led to this, but you can now, I mean, I'm just writing a new version of my Highlife Time, which I wrote in 1996, and I've got this mentioned also, the rise of Sahelian music, which we never had before in Ghana, because Highlife is largely a southern phenomenon. In fact, I've only ever heard in Ghana, in the early days, one band that played in Hausa, and that was a Nigerian group. They were called the Delta Dandies. I think they came from Nigeria, and they often sang in Hausa. And you do occasionally get Highlife sung in Dagbani or Hausa. It was very occasional. Highlife was largely southern, Akan, Ewe, Ga. But now the whole thing has changed. The north is being developed, it has electricity, and a lot of its traditional music is interfacing with Western type of music. So it reminds me a little bit about what was happening about 30-40 years ago here, when you get, say, Afro rock or Afro beats, soul or rock meets African music, that interface. Now you're getting that interface happening up in the north. A new interface. Yeah.
Exciting. How about the radio, the media, the TV? Well, it's exploded, and I guess there are many more media stations, and like you say, there are more recording studios in Ghana. Again, comparison to 20 years ago.
Oh yes, there's now I think around about 270 FM stations.
Whoa.
And about 30 television stations.
Yeah.
And so that you do get specialist programs now that deal with, they call it country music, but that means old time high life or guitar band music. So you get that type of specialization, but there is a problem, is that it's very difficult. They don't log the music and they don't pay the musicians royalties. So there is still a problem for the musicians in getting royalties. And also for a number of years, there's been a number of very corrupt leaderships of the copyright bodies. This has gone on and on and on. In fact, just last year, another coup occurred in the copyright body, you know, the one that collects royalties, and now it's been taken over by some other people. We've yet to see what happens. But that revenue for musicians, Ghanaian composers, has never been fully tapped, because the radio stations and the TV stations, it's very spasmodic. They do pay somebody sometimes, but it hasn't been, they don't systematically collect the money and then get the money to the artists. And now, of course, on top of this, we have internet, with piracy, let's call it internet sharing or whatever, you know, so that the Ghanaians are missing out on that, because they haven't got themselves organized into collecting royalties from internet sales. So this is another problem. But some of the musicians, particularly the hiplife generation, are very money conscious. You know, my generation wasn't that money conscious, the musicians. The younger generation, one of the good things I think that they realized when they sort of opposed their parents is that for all the talk about Highlife, every single Highlife musician in Ghana died in poverty. So the hiplife generation decided they weren't going to die in poverty. So they became sort of very, it's not just materialism is reflected in their lyrics, fast car, plenty of money, bling bling, jewelry. It's also reflected in the way they run their bands. It's not really a band, it's an individual with an engineer, as a business. And they make deals for advertising companies, and they make deals with telephone companies for telephone jingles. So the younger generation actually is beginning to make money from music from that way, and also big shows where they get large amounts of money. But in terms of copyright, it still hasn't really been solved in Ghana.
No. Well, in Europe and I guess in the Western world, we talk a lot about disruption. That within the music industry of the Western world, the classical big companies, they have lost everything, because it's all on the internet, and it's impossible to make money by selling music. You have to go back to a situation before the LP where you have to go and perform live.
Yes.
And that means that the prices of a live concert ticket has risen a lot. Has there been anything like this in Ghana too?
It's exactly happening here. What's happened here, everything you said applies to Ghana. First of all, our promoters, our music producers, no longer invest in an artist to produce a CD, because as soon as the CD's out, it's pirated. So that one source of income is not here any longer for Ghanaian musicians, finding a producer. And then what's a lot of the younger hiplifers and dancehall musicians do is exactly what you said. They make their money from big shows. So you don't have nightclubs where you have a regular band. You just have these occasional big shows where the stars will make a lot of money. And in fact, in Ghana, we don't really have the infrastructure for live performances on a regular basis. We have the stadium or something for a big show, but these small clubs with resident bands we don't have. And this has led to a big difference between Ghana and Nigeria. See, the problem facing musicians, there are three sources of income. You sell records or CDs, you get the mechanical royalties. Okay, then you get the performance royalties through airplay, television, radio. Okay, now those are both gone in Ghana. They've also gone in Nigeria, gone I think probably everywhere in the world. So your only source of income is live performance. Now in Nigeria, they have always maintained a live performance network, not for the big stars, but even for the smaller bands. And you actually make your money in Nigeria from live performance, not from your record sales or airplay, because you don't get any money that way. In Ghana, except for some of the younger generation, all three sources of revenue are blocked. No producers, no royalties from airplay, and what was the other one? No places to play.
No.
You know, unless you're a sort of superstar type, and you can make a one-off very big show, like Kojo Entry will come and do a big Christmas show. But there are no clubs where you I'm not saying there are none. Obviously there are few, but they're very few and far between. So we don't have a live music circuit much. And during the period of hiplife, that circuitry or that circuit for live music sort of died off because people were miming. I mean, they would go to a live dance hall spot and mime. You see, so a lot, the whole idea of live performance sort of died off. Whereas the Nigerians never allowed their live music to die off. And now that's saving the musicians. So a lot of Ghanaian musicians will go to Nigeria to perform. It's very interesting. There's a lot of going to and fro between the two countries at the moment.
Is it still a goal for a musician to go to Europe and go to the United States of America? Do they still attract musicians the same way they did maybe
Hasn't
in
changed
the
at all. If anything, it's worse.
It's okay.
I mean, practically every young Ghanaian, not musician, every young Ghanaian, if he had half a chance, he would leave Ghana. Because what future is there in Ghana? We're an imitation of Western capitalism, which itself is not working. But of course, the image coming from the capitalist West into Ghana through these, I don't know, soaps, TV soaps, is always a sort of a very well-to-do, middle-class family, with the mother, the grandparents, and the uncles. Sometimes they're black, sometimes they're white, and the whole place is paved with gold and so on. The message that this no longer exists in the West. People don't even live in families in America anymore. They live in single-parent families. It hasn't percolated to here. It's still the glitter of the West of being the dominant force in the world. So that message in no way has got less. And of course, the Africans, not just Ghanaians, have not done what China and India have managed to, or even Japan, is to create a modern technological civilization not based on Western Protestant principles. Africa was denied this because, Lumumba and Nkrumah, the early leaders who want to unify Africa and create an African sort of socialism based on technology. They weren't against modern technology, but they wanted to humanize it through African communalism. The West said that means communism, so they crushed it. So a lot of African countries are just following the American dream, still. And they haven't seen that the American dream is no more, even for Americans. So I can't say that there may be some of the youth maybe are thinking that, that there has to be an African alternative, but basically it's not reflected in politics or the education system. There's nothing like what's happened in China. I mean, look what happened. China was able to get through colonialism without being dismembered into pieces. They were lucky enough to have Mao Zedong and the Communist Party. India was also, it was dismembered after British colonialism with Pakistan breaking away, but India itself is a big enough continental power, this is to do with critical mass and modern technology. You have to have countries of a certain size. Japan, even after the war, even though it was atom bombed by the Americans, they still retained certain traditional belief systems, like ancestor worship, and family. They've incorporated it into their capitalist structure. Japan incorporated. I'm not saying whether these things are all wonderful, but what they've proven to the world is that modern life, modern industrial civilization, doesn't always have to necessitate the Protestant work ethic. Anal retention and all the sickness, schizophrenic sickness of what we're seeing now appear in the West. But Africa was denied this. And Africa had a great contribution to make to humanizing technology. The West now, they're using technology to dehumanize. They're inventing robots and drones. It's getting worse and worse. That new possibility that Africa can contribute to that. There are certain ways Africa can contribute even now. I'll give you just one. It's not only a negative story, but let me just give you one story. About Europe. Basically, Europeans are now godless. They don't believe in God, they don't worship, they don't go to churches. Even in Italy and Spain, they've all become godless. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but it's very good for people to have a moral code of some sort. And embedded in Christianity is a sort of a human ethics and things like that. If you become godless, you can be lost. But the thing is, of course, the religion, the Western religion, has become godless, because the European form of Christianity is dedicated to having a miserable life, so you go to heaven when you're dead. So the Christian in the West have created a type of religion which is still the underpinning of Western civilization, Christianity, but it's dedicated, it's otherworldly. It means that it's all to do with when you're dead and gone, okay? I mean, you could say living a miserable life, or saving up your money to spend when you're old, but you never arrive at that old age, you know. It's this sort of miserly thing that's in the West, or inability to use money for enjoyment or good purposes now. Now in Africa, what they've done is they've turned Christianity inside out. All the churches, if you go to them in Ghana, the mega churches, the small African churches, the thousands of them in Nigeria, they all are telling you that they are not pagan. They have nothing to do with traditional African beliefs. They've rejected paganism, African gods.